I'm Edward, your host, and it's a pleasure to share this quiet moment with you. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and do you enjoy snowy days, or are you already looking forward to sunny ones? Write it below and subscribe for a new mystery every day. Now, settle back and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Morning After the Snow. St. Mary Mead had woken that January morning to find itself wrapped in the particular hush that follows a night of steady snowfall. It was the sort of silence that seemed to muffle not only sound, but thought itself, so that even the most talkative souls found themselves speaking in lowered voices without quite understanding why. Miss Marple, drawing back her bedroom curtains shortly after 8 o'clock, observed with quiet satisfaction that the snow had fallen evenly and well. The garden lay smooth and unmarked beneath its white coverlet, and the bare branches of the apple tree wore their burden with a patience that seemed almost deliberate. It was, she reflected, the kind of morning that made one grateful for a warm fire and a properly brewed pot of tea. By 9:30, having attended to both these comforts and having consumed a modest breakfast of toast and marmalade, she decided that the morning service would be worth the careful walk through the snow. The church bells, when they rang, seemed to carry differently in the muffled air, their sound somehow rounder and softer than usual. She dressed warmly, as befitted a lady of advancing years on a winter morning, and set out with her umbrella serving more as a walking stick than as protection from precipitation. The snow crunched pleasantly beneath her sensible boots, and she noted with interest how the world seemed smaller somehow, as though the whiteness had drawn everything closer together. The churchyard path had been partially cleared by someone industrious, though snow still lay thick upon the grass between the graves. Miss Marple walked slowly, partly from caution, and partly from that natural contemplative pace that the morning seemed to demand. One could not hurry through such a scene without feeling rather impious about it. It was as she approached the lich gate that she became aware of a small gathering near the church door. Several familiar figures stood in a loose cluster, their attention fixed upon something beyond her immediate line of sight. Among them she recognised Mrs. Elspeth Crane, a widow of some years' standing whose dignified bearing and generous spirit had earned her considerable respect in the village. Mrs. Crane was gesturing with one gloved hand, her expression troubled in a way that seemed unusual for so composed a woman. Miss Marple continued her careful progress along the path, and as she drew nearer, the object of their collective attention became startlingly clear. The churchyard was a tapestry of white. Every headstone wore its cap of snow, every monument bore its soft burden, every plot lay smooth and even beneath the January covering. Every plot, that is, day one. Near the eastern edge of the cemetery, perhaps 20 yards from where the small group stood, a single grave lay dark and bare. The earth upon it appeared almost black against the surrounding whiteness, damp and undisturbed by so much as a single flake. It stood out with such stark clarity that one might have thought it had been deliberately cleared, though for what purpose Miss Marple could not immediately fathom. "Most extraordinary," Mrs. Crane was saying as Miss Marple approached. Her voice carried that particular note of forced lightness that people adopt when something has disturbed them more than they wish to admit. "I noticed it the moment I arrived. One can hardly help but see it." The vicar, a kindly man of moderate learning and immoderate good nature, laughed gently. "Nature plays curious tricks, Mrs. Crane. The wind, perhaps, or some peculiarity of the ground itself." "Wind doesn't clear snow in such a precise fashion," remarked Mr. Harold Preece, the church warden, with the air of a man who took considerable pride in being right about such matters. "And I walked the churchyard myself only yesterday afternoon. Everything was in perfect order." "Whose grave is it?" asked Miss Marple quietly. There was a brief pause before Mrs. Crane replied. "Mr. Arthur Bell. He was buried only 3 days ago. You may remember, Miss Marple, he passed rather suddenly." Miss Marple did remember, though only vaguely. Arthur Bell had been one of those quiet souls who pass through life leaving barely a ripple behind them. He had been a clerk of some sort at the county offices, she believed, and had lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village. His death had been noted with that polite sympathy that communities extend to their less prominent members, but there had been little in the way of genuine grief. "How very odd," she murmured, looking thoughtfully at the bare patch of earth. "Boys, most likely," said Mr. Priest with conviction. "Young ruffians thinking it amusing to disturb the peace of the dead. I shall speak to the constable about it." "Surely not," protested Mrs. Crane, speaking rather more quickly than seemed quite natural. "What boy would come to a churchyard in the middle of a snowy night? It seems far more probable that it's simply a matter of the soil retaining warmth, or some such thing. Don't you think, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple did not immediately answer. She had been observing not the grave itself, but the path leading to it, and something about the way the snow lay troubled her, in a fashion she could not yet define. The snow appeared undisturbed, certainly, but there was something about its surface near the lich gate, a quality of compression perhaps, as though someone had walked there and the snow had fallen again afterward to cover their tracks. It was the merest impression, hardly worth mentioning, and yet it nagged at her nonetheless. "The ground cools at night," she said at last. "It does not warm itself." Dr. Haydock, who had joined the group while they stood talking, nodded his grizzled head. "Quite right, Miss Marple. Earth loses heat, doesn't generate it, unless there's been some disturbance of the soil itself." "But who would disturb a grave?" Mrs. Crane's voice rose slightly. "And for what earthly purpose?" "Perhaps the dogs got at it," suggested the vicar hopefully. "They do sometimes, you know, though it's most distressing to contemplate." Miss Marple said nothing, but she walked a few steps closer to the grave in question, moving carefully on the snowy ground. She paused at a respectful distance and stood quite still, her eyes taking in details that others seemed content to overlook. The headstone was simple, bearing only Arthur Bell's name and the dates of his birth and death. The earth before it showed no signs of animal interference, no disturbed clods or scratches. It was simply bare, as though the snow had chosen, by some inexplicable preference, not to settle there. She touched the soil lightly with the tip of her umbrella. It was neither warm nor particularly cold, but it had certainly been disturbed within recent hours. The texture was wrong for earth that had lain undisturbed through a night of snowfall. "Most puzzling," she remarked, straightening up slowly. "Oh, I'm sure there's a perfectly simple explanation," said Mrs. Crane, pulling her coat more closely about herself. "These things always have rational causes when one looks into them properly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really must hurry home. I've 100 things to attend to this morning." She walked away rather more briskly than the snowy path quite warranted, and Miss Marple watched her go with that mild, steady gaze that so often saw more than people realized. The small group dispersed as the church bells began their final summons, and Miss Marple joined the stream of parishioners making their way inside. But throughout the service, as the familiar words washed over her, and the organ played its solemn harmonies, her thoughts kept returning to that single dark rectangle in the snow. Snow fell evenly, or it did not fall at all. Wind might drift it, certainly, but the churchyard had been sheltered, and there had been no wind to speak of during the night. Animals might disturb the earth, but they would leave signs of their disturbance. Someone had been at that grave, and recently. Someone had stood or knelt there long enough to prevent the snow from settling, and that someone had done so in the darkest hours of the morning when honest folk were safely in their beds. The question was not what had happened to the snow. The question was why anyone should wish to visit Arthur Bell's grave in secret, and what they had hoped to accomplish there. Miss Marple bowed her head during the final prayer, but her mind was already turning over possibilities with the gentle, relentless thoroughness of a tide washing over pebbles on a shore. Chapter 2. One Grave Left Dark. By midday, the phenomenon of Arthur Bell's bare grave had become the village's principal subject of conversation. Miss Marple, returning from church along the high street, could hear it being discussed in voices that carried through shop doorways and over garden walls. The topic had that particular magnetism that attaches itself to events which are unusual without being immediately explicable, and which permit a satisfying variety of theories without requiring anyone to commit themselves to actual knowledge. At the post office, Mrs. Clement was holding forth to a small audience about the mysterious ways of nature. My sister's husband, who keeps bees in Somerset, told me once that snow won't settle where the ground has been disturbed by spirits, she announced, with the confidence of someone repeating information they only half believe themselves. Miss Marple purchased her stamps and said nothing, though she permitted herself a small smile as she left. Spirits, in her considerable experience, were far less troublesome than the living, and considerably less given to leaving tangible evidence of their activities. The bakery proved equally animated. Young Mrs. Porter, whose husband worked at the railway station, had developed the theory that underground springs might be responsible. Warmth rising from below, she explained to anyone who would listen. It stands to reason, doesn't it? The water comes up warm and melts the snow from underneath. Miss Marple, selecting 2 currant buns for her tea, reflected that it stood to very little reason at all, given that underground springs did not typically confine their warmth to areas precisely the size and shape of a fresh grave. But she kept this observation to herself and complimented Mrs. Porter on the excellent appearance of her cottage loaves. It was in the tea room, however, that Miss Marple found the most illuminating conversation of the morning. She had settled herself at her preferred table near the window, from which she could observe the street without appearing to pay it undue attention, when Mr. Harold Preece entered with an air of purposeful authority. The churchwarden had clearly been giving the matter considerable thought since the morning's discovery. He made his way to the corner table where Dr. Haydock sat reading the newspaper, and launched into an explanation that required no preamble. "I've examined the gate," he announced. "Locked, just as it should have been. I checked it myself last evening before dark, and I was the first to unlock it this morning. No one could have entered that churchyard during the night without the key." Dr. Haydock lowered his newspaper with the patient expression of a man accustomed to listening to theories he knew to be flawed. "Unless they climbed over the wall, Preece." "A man climbing a stone wall in the middle of a snowstorm?" Mr. Preece's tone suggested this was tantamount to scaling the north face of the Matterhorn. And for what purpose? To clear snow from a grave? It defies all logic. "Most human behaviour does," remarked Haydock mildly. "That's what makes it interesting." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, found herself in quiet agreement with the doctor's observation. Logic was a useful tool, certainly, but it had distinct limitations when applied to the study of human nature. People did all manner of illogical things when prompted by guilt, affection, fear, or any of those other powerful currents that moved beneath the surface of respectable life. The tea-room door opened again, admitting a blast of cold air, and a young man whom Miss Marple recognised as Tom Bell. He was Arthur Bell's nephew, a lean fellow in his early 30s with the sort of anxious face that suggested he worried rather more than was good for him. He had arrived in the village only a week before his uncle's death, Miss Marple recalled, and had been present at the funeral, though he had left almost immediately afterward. Mr. Preece hailed him with the heartiness that some people employ when addressing the recently bereaved, as though cheerfulness might somehow compensate for loss. "Mr. Bell, we were just discussing this curious business with your uncle's grave. Extraordinary thing, what? The snow refusing to settle, I mean." Tom Bell approached the table with visible reluctance. "Yes, I heard about it at the inn. Most peculiar." He paused, then added with rather more force than seemed quite necessary, "Though I expect there's a simple explanation. The soil, you know, it must retain heat longer than the surrounding ground. Simple physics, really." Dr. Haydock regarded him with interest. "Earth doesn't retain heat in January, my boy. It loses it. If anything, freshly turned soil would be colder than ground that's been settled for years." "Ah, well, I'm no scientist," Tom Bell said quickly. "But surely there must be some natural cause. One can't go suspecting supernatural interference every time something seems a bit odd." "No one's mentioned the supernatural," observed Mr. Preece, "though there are those in the village who lean towards such explanations." Tom Bell's jaw tightened slightly. "Village gossip. My uncle was a quiet man who harmed no one. I can't see why anyone would wish to disturb his rest, by natural means or otherwise." Miss Marple, who had been giving every appearance of being absorbed in buttering a scone, looked up at this. You were very fond of your uncle, Mr. Bell." The young man turned to her, seeming to notice her presence for the first time. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple. Yes, I was. That is, we weren't close exactly, but he was family. One has obligations." "Of course," said Miss Marple gently. "And you came to St. Mary Mead specially to see him before the end?" "I came as soon as I heard he was unwell. Unfortunately, I arrived rather too late." There was genuine regret in his voice, though whether it was regret for his uncle's death or for something else Miss Marple could not immediately determine. "He died the evening I reached the village. I was still at the inn unpacking my things." "How very sad for you," Miss Marple murmured. "To have travelled all that way and missed the opportunity to speak with him." "Yes," Tom Bell seemed eager to change the subject. "Well, I must be going. I've affairs to settle, papers to go through. My uncle's cottage needs to be cleared, and I'm catching the London train tomorrow evening." He departed with a stiff nod to the assembled company, and silence settled over the table for a moment after his exit. "Nervous sort of fellow," remarked Mr. Preece, "though grief affects people in different ways, I suppose." "Indeed it does," said Dr. Haydock, "though I'm not entirely convinced that what we're seeing is grief." Miss Marple finished her scone with delicate precision, but her mind was occupied with something Tom Bell had said, or rather, with something he had been very careful to establish. He had not been at the churchyard since the funeral. He had made that point quite clearly, though no one had asked him about his movements. People who went out of their way to establish their absence from a particular place often had very good reasons for doing so, and those reasons were not always innocent. She thought again of the path to the grave, of that subtle compression in the snow that might have been footsteps covered by fresh fall. She thought of Tom Bell's anxious face and his quick resort to scientific explanations that didn't quite hold together under examination, and she thought, too, of Mrs. Elspeth Crane's odd haste that morning, her eagerness to dismiss the mystery as nothing of consequence. Mrs. Crane, who was known for her thoughtfulness and her attention to detail, who had paid for Arthur Bell's funeral flowers herself, as a kindness. Kindness was a virtue, certainly, but in Miss Marple's experience, excessive kindness sometimes masked other feelings entirely, obligation perhaps, or guilt. Dr. Haydock rose to leave, folding his newspaper with deliberate care. "Well, Miss Marple, what do you make of our little mystery?" "I think," said Miss Marple slowly, "that snow falls where it will, but it melts according to quite specific laws, and one of those laws is that warmth leaves traces." The doctor looked at her sharply. "You believe someone was at that grave after the snow began?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, gathering her gloves and handbag, "that truth has a way of showing itself, rather like dark earth beneath white snow. One has only to know where to look." She smiled at him with perfect pleasantness and made her way to the door. Behind her she could hear Mr. Preece beginning another explanation about the impossibility of entering a locked churchyard, his voice carrying the determined note of a man who preferred his mysteries to have tidy solutions. But Miss Marple had lived too long and seen too much to believe that life arranged itself according to anyone's preferences. The truth, when it emerged, was rarely tidy, but it was always there, waiting patiently to be discovered by those with eyes willing to see it. Chapter 3. Miss Marple considers the melt. Lady Bantry had telephoned shortly after luncheon, with an invitation that was less a request than a friendly command. "Come to tea, Jane. I'm simply dying to hear what you make of this ridiculous business with the grave. Dolly Parsons has been going on about portents and ill omens until I thought I should scream." Miss Marple, who had anticipated spending a quiet afternoon with her knitting and library book, found herself instead walking through the now familiar snowy landscape toward the comparative grandeur of the Bantry residence. The afternoon had turned milder, and she noticed with interest how the snow had begun to soften at its edges, acquiring that faintly greyish quality that presaged eventual melt. Lady Bantry received her in the drawing-room, where a cheerful fire crackled and the tea things had been laid out with more enthusiasm than precision. Dolly Bantry had never quite mastered the art of domestic arrangement, but she made up for it with warmth and an endearing lack of pretension. "Now then," she said, settling herself into her favourite chair with the air of someone preparing for an entertaining performance. "Tell me everything. The whole village is in an absolute ferment over this Snow business. Mrs. Hartnell stopped me after church to inform me that it's clearly a judgment of some sort, though upon whom or for what she couldn't quite specify." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and arranged herself comfortably. People do enjoy a mystery, don't they? Particularly one that allows for a great many theories without requiring any actual investigation. "But surely you must have a theory," Dolly protested. "You always do. Something wonderfully clever about human nature that makes everything perfectly clear once you've explained it." "I'm not certain about clever," Miss Marple said mildly. "But I have been thinking about snow. How it behaves, I mean. We tend to think of it as capricious falling, where it will, and melting according to whim. But in fact, snow follows quite predictable rules." "Does it?" Lady Bantry looked sceptical. "It seems rather random to me." "Not at all. Snow melts in response to warmth, my dear. A hearth warms the floorboards beneath it, and the snow melts from that room's windows first. A lamp left burning in a garden shed will clear a small circle on the roof above it. Even the warmth from an animal's body, if it should rest in one place long enough, will melt the snow beneath it." Dolly frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I follow. Are you suggesting that someone's dog sat on Arthur Bell's grave all night?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple, selecting a small sandwich with care, "that snow doesn't simply fail to fall on one particular spot. It falls, and then it melts. The question is what provided the warmth to melt it. But the ground would be freezing in January." "Quite so. Which means the warmth must have come from above the ground, not below it." There was a moment of silence as Lady Bantry absorbed this. Then her eyes widened. "You mean a person? Someone was there?" "It would explain the evidence rather neatly." "Good heavens!" Dolly set down her teacup with a rattle. "But who would visit a grave in the middle of a snowstorm, and why?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting. She had brought her work with her, a habit that allowed her hand occupation while her mind wandered through more complex patterns. People visit graves for all sorts of reasons: to pay respects, to seek solace, to ease a troubled conscience. Arthur Bell was buried only 3 days ago. Surely there's been adequate time for grave visiting during daylight hours. "One would think so," Miss Marple agreed. "Unless, of course, one wished to visit unobserved." Dolly leaned forward with the avid interest of someone who had stumbled onto a particularly engaging plot. "You think someone had reason to hide their visit? But Arthur Bell was such an ordinary little man. I can't imagine him inspiring that sort of dramatic behaviour." "Ordinary people often inspire the strongest feelings," Miss Marple observed. "I knew a woman in the village once, a very respectable widow who organised the church flowers for 30 years. When she died, her niece came to the grave every night for a week, though she had barely spoken to her aunt in life. Turned out the aunt had lent her money for her marriage portion, and the niece had never properly thanked her. Guilt is a powerful motivator, Dolly, and it doesn't always operate according to logic." "Is that what you think happened here? Someone feeling guilty about Arthur Bell?" Miss Marple considered the question while her fingers worked steadily at the wool. "I think it's worth knowing more about Mr. Bell's final days. The funeral was arranged very quickly, I understand, barely 24 hours from death to burial." "Was it? I confess I didn't pay much attention. I sent flowers, of course, but I didn't attend the service. I barely knew the man." "Neither did most people, it seems. Yet Mrs. Crane arranged the funeral flowers personally and paid the sexton herself. She told me this morning it was done as a kindness." "Elspeth Crane is a kind woman," Dolly said firmly. "Everyone says so. She's always the first to organise help when someone's in need." "Quite," said Miss Marple, "which is why it seems odd that she should be so insistent this morning that the bare grave was of no consequence. A natural phenomenon, she called it, almost as though she wished to discourage any further thought on the matter." Lady Bantry absorbed this with visible concentration. "You think Mrs. Crane was the person at the grave?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mrs. Crane knew Arthur Bell better than the general acquaintance would suggest. and I think there may have been circumstances surrounding his death that have not been fully explained. Good heavens, Jane, you're not suggesting murder? Not necessarily. Death comes in many forms, and not all of them require deliberate malice. But I am suggesting that someone feels uncomfortable about how Mr. Bell died, uncomfortable enough to seek some form of reconciliation at his graveside in the darkest hours of the morning. Dolly was silent for a moment, gazing into the fire. Then she said slowly, "Tom Bell arrived just before his uncle died, didn't he? I remember hearing something about it at the post office. Rather tragic, really, to travel all that way and arrive too late. According to his own account, he was still at the inn when his uncle passed away. He didn't see him alive. How dreadful for the poor man." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Yes, one would think so. Yet he seemed more anxious to establish the fact than grieved by it. And he's leaving tomorrow evening, which suggests either very efficient settling of affairs or a certain eagerness to depart. Well, I suppose there's not much to keep him here. The cottage to be cleared, a few papers to sign. These things can be managed quickly enough when one has the will to do so. Indeed, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression thoughtful. Though one might wonder why Mrs. Crane took such an active role in the arrangements, paying for flowers, managing details. It goes rather beyond the usual neighbourly kindness. Perhaps she felt sorry for the poor man, dying alone. Perhaps she felt responsible in some way. Lady Bantry poured herself another cup of tea, her face troubled. "You're suggesting that Arthur Bell didn't die quite as simply as we've been led to believe?" "I'm suggesting that death certificates record facts, not context. Dr. Haydock certified the death, and I've no doubt his medical judgment was sound. But there are deaths that arrive through neglect, through delay, through small failures of care that never appear in official records. And you think Mrs. Crane was somehow involved?" "I think," said Miss Marple, choosing her words with precision, "that Mrs. Crane is a woman of conscience, and conscience, my dear Dolly, is often the severest judge of all. It drives people to do things that might seem irrational to an outside observer. Kneeling in the snow before dawn, for instance, seeking some form of forgiveness that cannot be granted by the living." The fire crackled softly, and outside the windows the afternoon light was beginning to fade. Miss Marple noticed that the snow on the nearest trees had started to drip, leaving dark patches on the bark beneath. "What will you do?" asked Lady Bantry at last. "Watch," said Miss Marple simply, "and listen. Truth has a way of emerging, given time and patience. Rather like spring bulbs pushing through snow. One cannot force them, but one can trust that they will appear when the conditions are right." She gathered her knitting and prepared to take her leave. As she reached the door, Dolly called after her, "Jane, be careful. If there really is something untoward about Arthur Bell's death, it might be dangerous to ask too many questions." Miss Marple turned back with a gentle smile. "My dear, I'm an elderly lady who knits and tends her garden. No one pays the slightest attention to what I do or don't ask. That's rather the point, you see." She walked home through the gathering dusk, her mind occupied with patterns that had nothing to do with knitting. Snow and warmth, guilt and kindness, hairs, hasty funerals and midnight vigils. Somewhere in these elements lay a story that someone very much wished to keep hidden. But secrets like snow had a limited season. Eventually, everything melted into view. Chapter 4. A Cemetery. Key kept too carefully. The following morning brought a thaw that was both gradual and inexorable. Miss Marple, observing from her window as she took her breakfast, noted how the roof lines had begun to show through their white covering, and how the garden path had developed a faint sheen of dampness. By mid-morning the transformation would be complete, and the snow that had caused such interest would be nothing more than patches of grey slush in shadowed corners. She had just finished washing her breakfast things when Mr. Harold Preece appeared at her door, his expression carrying that mixture of self-importance and civic duty that characterized his approach to most matters. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have a word. It's regarding this business with the churchyard." She invited him in and offered tea, which he declined with a wave of his hand that suggested he had more pressing concerns than refreshment. "I've been thinking a great deal about the security of the churchyard," he began, settling himself rather stiffly into the armchair she indicated. "As church warden, it's my responsibility to ensure the sanctity of the burial ground. You understand, I'm sure." "Of course," said Miss Marple, taking her own seat and arranging her hands in her lap with patient attention. "I wanted you to understand, as one of the more sensible members of our community, that there could have been no unauthorized entry to the churchyard on the night in question." He leaned forward slightly, as though imparting information of great significance. "The key to the main gate is kept under the strictest control." "Indeed! I confess I hadn't given much thought to the security arrangements." Mr. Priest looked pleased, as people do when offered an opportunity to explain systems they have personally instituted. "The key is kept in a locked drawer in my study. It has been since I assumed the wardenship 5 years ago. Before that it was simply hung on a hook in the vestry, available to anyone who happened to wander in, most irregular." "How very organised of you," Miss Marple murmured. "I thought it necessary. One hears such stories these days of vandalism and disrespect. Young people with nothing better to do than cause mischief." He shook his head with the sorrowful air of one confronting the decline of civilization. "The key remains locked away at all times, except when I myself unlock the gate in the morning and lock it again in the evening." "You do this personally every day?" "Without fail. Rain or shine, I walk to the church at 8 o'clock in the morning and again at dusk. It's a matter of principle." He spoke with evident pride. "On the night of the snowfall I locked the gate at precisely 5:30 in the afternoon and unlocked it again at 8 the following morning. No one could have entered during those hours without my knowledge." Miss Marple regarded him with mild curiosity. "Not even with another key?" "There is no other key. I had the lock changed when I took up the position, and only one key was cut. I keep it on a ring with my other personal keys, and that ring never leaves my possession, except when the drawer is locked." It was said with such absolute conviction that Miss Marple found herself almost believing in the impossibility of entry. Almost, but not quite. In her experience, systems that appeared foolproof often contained very small, very human vulnerabilities that their designers preferred not to acknowledge. "How very reassuring," she said. "Though I wonder, Mr. Priest, whether the key might occasionally be borrowed. For legitimate purposes, of course. Someone wishing to visit a grave at an unusual hour, perhaps, or to check on the flowers after dark." A slight flush crept up Mr. Priest's neck. "Well, naturally, in exceptional circumstances, I might lend the key to a responsible party. But such occasions are rare, and I keep a careful record of any such loans." "Of course you do," said Miss Marple gently. "And might there have been any such loan in recent days?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple read a small but significant truth. Mr. Priest was a man who valued rules and systems, but he was also susceptible to requests from respectable people, particularly those who knew how to appeal to his sense of importance. "Mrs. Crane did borrow the key last week," he admitted at last, "but only for the most commendable reason. She wished to check the funeral wreaths one evening, concerned that the frost might damage them. I saw no harm in allowing her access for such a purpose. Naturally not. Mrs. Crane is most thoughtful about such matters." "Precisely, and she returned the key the very next morning as promised." He paused, then added with renewed firmness, "But that was several days before the snowfall. It has no bearing on the matter at hand." Miss Marple inclined her head in acknowledgement, though her thoughts were moving along different paths. Mrs. Crane had borrowed the key. Mrs. Crane, who had paid for Arthur Bell's funeral flowers, who had arranged so many details with such care, who had seemed so anxious to dismiss the mystery of the bare grave as nothing of consequence. "I am sure you're right," she said aloud. "Though I suppose one might wonder whether Mrs. Crane could have had a copy made during the time the key was in her possession." Mr. Priest's expression suggested that this possibility had not occurred to him, and that he found it distinctly uncomfortable now that it had been raised. "Mrs. Crane would never do such a thing. She's a woman of impeccable character." I'm certain she is. I merely meant that it would be technically possible, would it not? I suppose, in a purely theoretical sense. He stood abruptly, clearly eager to conclude a conversation that had strayed into uncomfortable territory. But I cannot believe that Mrs. Crane, of all people, would engage in anything underhanded. The very suggestion is absurd. Miss Marple rose as well, her manner placating. I intended no suggestion, Mr. Priest. I was simply following the thread of possibility. You've been most helpful in explaining the security arrangements. It's clear you take your responsibilities very seriously indeed. Mollified somewhat, he made his farewells and departed, leaving Miss Marple standing by her window and watching his upright figure make its way down the garden path. She returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, but her fingers moved slowly, almost mechanically, while her mind pursued thoughts that had nothing to do with pattern or stitch. Mr. Priest had not wanted to consider the possibility that Mrs. Crane might have had the key copied. Such a consideration would have complicated his carefully maintained system and, worse, would have required him to doubt the character of someone the village held in high regard. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that character was not a simple matter of black and white. Good people did questionable things when driven by powerful emotions. Fear could make the honest deceptive. Guilt could drive the kind to desperate measures. And love, or whatever approximation of it flourished in the hidden chambers of respectable hearts, could inspire behaviour that would shock those who thought they knew a person well. Mrs. Crane had borrowed the key to check flowers at night, or so she had claimed. But flowers, as Miss Marple had observed to the vicar's wife, rarely minded the dark. They neither grew nor withered any faster in the evening than they did during the day. What Mrs. Crane had actually done with that key during the hours it was in her possession remained an open question, and whether she had returned it without first ensuring she could gain access to the churchyard whenever she wished was another question that warranted consideration. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the quiet room. Outside, the snow continued its slow retreat, revealing the brown earth beneath. By tomorrow, perhaps the day after, it would be gone entirely, and the village would turn its attention to other matters. But some things, once disturbed, could not simply melt away. They remained, patient and persistent, waiting for someone with sufficient attention to notice what others had overlooked. And Miss Marple, whatever her other qualities might be, had never lacked for attention to detail. Chapter 5. Tea taken at the wrong hour. Miss Marple had noticed over the years that timing revealed a great deal about human habits and intentions. People were creatures of routine, after all, and deviations from established patterns often signified something more than mere whim. It was with this principle in mind that she found herself, shortly after 3 o'clock that afternoon, making her way along Meadow Lane toward Mrs. Elspeth Crane's cottage. The snow had retreated considerably since morning, leaving only stubborn remnants in the shadows of walls and hedgerows. The lane itself was muddy underfoot, and Miss Marple picked her way carefully, grateful for her stout boots and the support of her umbrella. Mrs. Crane's cottage was a picture of well-maintained respectability. The garden, though dormant for winter, showed evidence of careful tending, and the windows gleamed with the peculiar brightness that spoke of regular attention. Miss Marple had passed by countless times on her afternoon walks and had often observed Mrs. Crane setting out at this hour, well wrapped against the weather, for her customary constitutional along the river path. Today, however, smoke rose steadily from the chimney, and the curtains were drawn back in a way that suggested occupation rather than absence. Miss Marple approached the door and knocked gently. There was a brief pause before it opened, and Mrs. Crane appeared, her expression suggesting that callers at this hour were both unexpected and not entirely welcome. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call." The words were cordial enough, but there was a certain tightness around the eyes that spoke of strain. "Do come in. I was just about to have tea." This in itself was unusual. Miss Marple knew from village observation that Mrs. Crane took her tea promptly at 4 o'clock, after returning from her walk. To be preparing it at 3 suggested a disruption to routine, and disruptions, in Miss Marple's experience, were worth noting. The sitting room was warm to the point of being rather stuffy. A fire blazed in the hearth with an intensity that seemed excessive for the mild afternoon, and Miss Marple noticed that the windows had been closed tight despite the comparative mildness outside. "You'll think me foolish," Mrs. Crane said, following her gaze, "but I've felt rather chilled today. One of those winter colds that settles in the bones, I expect." "How disagreeable for you," Miss Marple murmured, settling herself in the chair indicated. She noticed that Mrs. Crane's colour was good and her movements showed no sign of illness, but she said nothing further on the subject. Mrs. Crane busied herself with the tea things, and Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander about the room with the mild, unfocused attention of an elderly lady whose thoughts might be anywhere. The furnishings were tasteful without being showy, the kind that spoke of moderate means carefully managed. A watercolour of what might have been the lake district hung above the mantelpiece, and several photographs in silver frames occupied a side table. It was near the hearth, however, that Miss Marple's attention settled with quiet interest. Draped over the back of a chair, positioned close to the fire, was a man's woolen scarf, the kind of substantial, serviceable garment that men wore for outdoor work in cold weather. It hung with the particular limpness of damp fabric still in the process of drying, and the ends showed darker patches where moisture had not yet fully evaporated. Mrs. Crane followed her gaze and spoke perhaps a shade too quickly. "That's Mr. Bell's scarf. Tom Bell, I mean, not his late uncle. He left it here when he called 2 days ago, and I'm afraid it got rather wet when I hung it outside to air. I brought it in to dry properly." "How thoughtful of you," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Bell must be grateful to have such a careful neighbour." "Oh, it's nothing really, just common courtesy." Mrs. Crane poured the tea with hands that were not quite steady. "He's leaving tomorrow, you know, catching the evening train to London. I thought I should have it ready for him before he departs." Miss Marple accepted her cup and added milk with careful deliberation. "He's not staying to settle his uncle's affairs, then?" "Everything's in order, apparently. Arthur Bell's possessions were few, and the cottage is rented. There's very little that requires attention." She paused, then added, "Tom was very efficient about it all. One could almost say eager to be gone." There was something in her tone that suggested disapproval, or perhaps disappointment. Miss Marple filed this observation away and sipped her tea, which was excellent despite being served at the wrong hour. "You knew Mr. Bell well, I think. Arthur Bell, I mean." Mrs. Crane's cup rattled slightly as she set it down. "Not especially well. He was a quiet neighbour, kept to himself, but one tries to be civil to those who live nearby. Of course, though I understand you were particularly kind in arranging his funeral, the flowers and such matters. Someone had to, he had no one else." The words came out more sharply than perhaps intended, and Mrs. Crane seemed to realise this. Her voice softened. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound irritable. It's just that it seemed rather sad. A man dying with so little to mark his passing. I thought someone should make the effort." "It was very charitable of you." "Charity." Mrs. Crane repeated the word as though tasting something bitter. "Is it charity when one is simply doing what should have been done sooner?" Miss Marple regarded her with gentle curiosity. "I'm not sure I follow." Mrs. Crane rose and moved to the window, her back to the room. When she spoke, her voice was low and careful. "Arthur Bell was a kind man, Miss Marple. People didn't notice him much, but he was kind. After my husband died, he helped me sort through the accounts. Harold had left everything in such a muddle, and I was quite at sea with figures. Mr. Bell came several evenings and worked through it all with such patience. He never asked for payment or even acknowledgement." "How good of him." "Yes." She turned back, her face composed but her eyes troubled. "And I never properly thanked him. One thinks there will always be time for such things, and then suddenly there isn't." Miss Marple understood in that moment a portion of what drove this woman's actions. Guilt was a heavy companion, and it made people do things that might seem excessive to those who had never felt its weight. But there was something more here, something that Mrs. Crane was not saying. "The scarf," Miss Marple said quietly, nodding toward the garment by the fire. "Must have been very wet to still be damp after 2 days of drying." Mrs. Crane's gaze flickered toward it and away. "The weather has been damp. Things take longer to dry in winter." "Indeed they do," Miss Marple agreed. Wool especially, it holds moisture in it. Fibres. I've noticed it can take 3 or 4 days to dry completely when brought in from a really thorough soaking. The silence that followed was delicate and taut. Mrs. Crane returned to her chair and picked up her teacup, though she did not drink from it. "You're very observant, Miss Marple." "One notices things when one has little else to occupy one's time," Miss Marple said mildly. "For instance, I noticed that you haven't taken your usual walk this afternoon, and that your fire is built rather higher than the weather warrants, and that Tom Bell's scarf is still quite damp, though you say he left it 2 days ago." Mrs. Crane set down her cup with precise care. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple replied, with perfect gentleness. "I'm simply observing that wet scarves tell stories, just as bare graves do. Sometimes those stories are not quite the ones we initially tell ourselves." Mrs. Crane's composure wavered, but she held it together with visible effort. "You must think me very foolish." "Not at all. I think you're troubled, my dear, and I think that trouble has to do with Arthur Bell's death and the circumstances surrounding it." For a long moment Mrs. Crane said nothing. Then she rose and moved to the window again, her shoulders tight with some internal struggle. "I'm not ready to speak of it," she said at last. "Not yet, perhaps not ever." Miss Marple gathered her things and prepared to leave. At the door she turned back. "Truth has a way of making itself known, Mrs. Crane. Sometimes it's gentler when we help it along, rather than waiting for it to force its way out." She walked home through the fading afternoon, her mind occupied with damp scarves and excessive fires and the particular quality of guilt that drove a woman to visit a grave in the hours before dawn. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, not yet complete but recognizable in outline. Soon, very soon, the picture would be clear. Chapter 6. The Scarf That Was Not Dried. Inspector Slack arrived in St. Mary Mead the following morning with the air of a man who had been summoned to deal with nonsense but was determined to discharge his duty nonetheless. Miss Marple, observing his arrival from her front window as she tended her indoor plants, noted that he made directly for the vicarage rather than the police house, which suggested he was taking the matter more seriously than his expression indicated. By midday, word had spread through the village that Inspector Slack had requested a conversation with Tom Bell at the inn where the young man had been lodging. This news reached Miss Marple via her daily woman, Mrs. Doherty, who had it from her sister, who worked in the inn's kitchen. "Making quite a production of it, they say," Mrs. Doherty reported while dusting the mantelpiece with more enthusiasm than precision. "Asked for a private parlour and everything. Though what there is to investigate about a bit of melted snow, I'm sure I couldn't say." Miss Marple, who was sitting by the window with her knitting, made a non-committal sound that encouraged further detail without seeming overly interested. "Mr. Bell seemed put out by it all, according to what I heard. Kept saying he had a train to catch and couldn't be delayed. But the inspector was firm about wanting to clear up a few points before he left the village." "How very thorough of Inspector Slack," Miss Marple murmured. It was not until late afternoon that Miss Marple learned the substance of the interview, and this information came from an unexpected source. Dr. Haydock, encountering her on the high street as she returned from the lending library, fell into step beside her with the casual manner of someone who had been hoping for precisely such a meeting. "Been talking to young Bell," he said without preamble. "Slack asked me to be present during the interview. Medical perspective, he said, though I suspect he just wanted a witness." "And what did you make of Mr. Bell?" Dr. Haydock considered this as they walked slowly past the shops. Nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, kept producing alibis before anyone asked for them. Always a suspicious sign in my experience. "What sort of alibis?" "Where he was the night his uncle died, where he's been since the funeral, when he last visited the churchyard. Had it all laid out neat as you please, times and locations. Too neat, if you ask me. A man with nothing to hide doesn't usually keep such careful track of his movements." They had reached the corner where their paths would diverge, but Dr. Haydock showed no inclination to hurry away. He gazed down the street toward the inn, his weathered face thoughtful. Thing is, Slack asked him about a scarf. Seemed someone mentioned seeing a man's scarf drying at Mrs. Crane's cottage. Slack wanted to know if it was his. Miss Marple's hands tightened slightly on her umbrella handle, but her voice remained placid. And was it? That's the interesting bit. Young Bell said he'd lost his scarf weeks ago. Couldn't remember where, but he was quite definite about not having left it at Mrs. Crane's cottage. Said he had barely been inside the place, just called once to pay his respects and thank her for arranging his uncle's funeral. I see. Then Slack asked him to describe the scarf he'd lost, and Bell gave a perfectly good description of a grey woolen scarf with a brown stripe. Nothing unusual about it. Dr. Haydock paused significantly. Except that according to what I heard, the scarf at Mrs. Crane's cottage is dark blue without any stripe at all. Miss Marple absorbed this information with outward calm, though her mind was working rapidly through the implications. So the scarf was not Tom Bell's. Doesn't appear to be, which raises the rather obvious question of whose scarf it actually is, and why Mrs. Crane told you it belonged to young Bell when apparently it doesn't. They stood in silence for a moment, the winter afternoon settling around them with that peculiar stillness that comes before darkness. A few shops had already lit their lamps, and warm light spilled onto the pavement in golden rectangles. There's something else, Dr. Haydock said. Slack asked Bell about the timing of his uncle's death, wanted to know exactly when he was informed and when he arrived at the village. Bell said he received a telegram at his lodgings in London on the morning of the day his uncle died, caught the afternoon train, and reached St. Mary Mead about 6:30 in the evening. After his uncle had passed away. That's what he claims. Says he went straight to the cottage, found the door locked, and learned from a neighbour that Arthur Bell had died, and his body had been taken to the undertaker's. All very unfortunate and sad, but nothing suspicious about it. No, nothing suspicious, Miss Marple agreed quietly. Except that one wonders who sent the telegram and how. They knew Arthur Bell was dying if the death came suddenly. Dr. Haydock gave her a sharp look. You've noticed that too, have you? I mentioned it to Slack, but he was more interested in establishing where everyone was the night the snow fell. Seemed to think that was the relevant question. Perhaps it is, said Mr. Marple, though I suspect the more important question is what happened the night before Arthur Bell died. That's when the real story began, I think. You believe there was something irregular about the death itself? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that Arthur Bell died of natural causes, just as Dr. Haydock certified. But I also believe that someone feels responsible for that death in a way that goes beyond simple grief. Responsible enough to visit his grave in secret and to tell small untruths about scarves and timing. Dr. Haydock grunted. Mrs. Crane, you mean? Mrs. Crane knew Arthur Bell rather better than she has acknowledged. He helped her with accounts after her husband died. They had what one might call a friendly acquaintance, perhaps more than that, and I think something happened the night before his death, something that has weighed on her conscience ever since. What sort of something? Miss Marple shook her head slowly. That I cannot yet say with certainty, but I think it involved delay and fear, and the kind of decision one makes in the moment that haunts one forever after. They parted ways as the church bell struck 5, and Miss Marple continued homeward through the gathering dusk. Her mind was occupied with scarves and their significance, a scarf hanging by Mrs. Crane's fire, still damp after supposedly 2 days of drying. A scarf that Tom Bell claimed was not his, that he had lost his own scarf weeks earlier. Wool held moisture in its fibres. Miss Marple knew this from long experience with her own knitting. A thoroughly soaked woolen scarf brought in from a night of snow and cold would take days to dry, completely even near a hot fire. 3 days, perhaps 4. And Arthur Bell had been dead only 3 days. Someone had been out in the snow the night before Arthur Bell's funeral, or perhaps the night he died. Someone had worn that scarf and returned it to Mrs. Crane's cottage wet and cold. And that someone was almost certainly not Tom Bell, who had been in London when his uncle passed away. Which left the question of who had actually worn the scarf, and why Mrs. Crane had claimed it belonged to Tom Bell when she must have known it did not. The answer, Miss Marple suspected, was both simple and terribly sad. Mrs. Crane was protecting someone, and the person she was protecting was herself. But from what exactly? That was the question that remained unanswered. From suspicion of murder? No, Miss Marple did not think murder had occurred here. But perhaps from suspicion of something equally damaging to a woman of Mrs. Crane's standing in the community. Negligence, perhaps, or a failure of care that had allowed a lonely man to die when he might have been saved. Miss Marple reached her cottage and let herself in, grateful for the warmth and familiarity of home. She put the kettle on for tea and sat down in her favourite chair, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Outside, the last traces of snow were melting away in the shadows. By morning they would be gone completely, and the earth would be bare once more. But some things, once revealed, could never be covered over again. Truth had a persistence that outlasted snow, and Miss Marple had a feeling that the truth in this case was very close to showing itself completely. Tomorrow, she thought, she would call on Mrs. Crane once more, and this time she would ask the questions that needed to be asked, gently but directly, because kindness, real kindness, sometimes meant forcing people to face what they had been hiding from, even when the hiding had been done with the best of intentions. Chapter 7. Churchyard Talk and Gentle Errors. The village had, by Friday morning, settled upon Tom Bell as the most likely source of whatever mystery surrounded his uncle's grave. This conclusion had been reached through that peculiar process of communal reasoning that favoured convenience over evidence, and preferred solutions that did not disturb established social hierarchies. Miss Marple heard the theory expounded in various forms throughout the day. At the greengrocer's, it was suggested that Tom Bell had visited the grave in secret to search for something his uncle might have been buried with. At the draper's shop, the speculation ran to guilt over arriving too late to see his uncle alive. By tea-time, Mrs. Hartnell had developed an elaborate scenario involving disputed inheritance and nocturnal grave robbing that bore no relation to any facts Miss Marple had encountered. What struck her most forcefully was how readily the village had accepted this narrative while carefully exempting Mrs. Crane from any suspicion whatsoever. Mrs. Crane was too respectable, too charitable, too firmly embedded in the village's good opinion to be considered as anything other than a helpful neighbour who had done her Christian duty. "After all," Lady Bantry remarked, when Miss Marple called at her house that afternoon, "Elspeth Crane is simply not the sort of person to involve herself in anything questionable. She arranges flowers for the church, for heaven's sake, and her husband was on the parish council for years before he died." "Quite so," said Miss Marple mildly, "though I've noticed that respectability sometimes serves as a very effective shield. People see what they expect to see." Dolly looked at her sharply. "You still think Mrs. Crane is somehow involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said, choosing her words with care, "that Mrs. Crane knows more than she has said. Whether that constitutes involvement is a matter of definition." She had excused herself shortly afterward, and made her way to the church, where she found the vicar in his study, wrestling with the following Sunday's sermon and looking grateful for the interruption. "Miss Marple, how delightful! Do come in. I was just struggling with the parable of the talents, which never seems to yield quite the sermon one hopes for." "I wonder if I might look at the parish register," Miss Marple said. "Just a matter of curiosity about some dates." The vicar was happy to oblige, producing the large leather-bound volume with the reverent care it deserved. He left her to her examination while he returned to his sermon, and Miss Marple settled herself at the desk with the register open before her. She turned to the entries for the January, and found Arthur Bell's burial recorded in the vicar's neat hand. The entry was thorough in most respects: name, date of burial, location of grave, officiating minister. But as she studied it more closely, Miss Marple noticed something that struck her as curious. The time of death had not been recorded. The date was there, January 21st, but no specific hour. This was unusual. Most death registrations included the time, particularly when the death had been attended by a physician. It helped establish clear records and avoided confusion. She sat back, her fingers resting lightly on the page, and considered what this omission might signify. Perhaps nothing. The vicar was not always meticulous about such details, but perhaps something. "Finding what you need?" the vicar called from his desk. "Yes, thank you, though I notice the time of death isn't recorded for Mr. Bell." The vicar looked up, his expression mildly apologetic. "Ah, yes. I'm afraid that was an oversight on my part. Dr. Haydock provided the certificate, of course, but I failed to note the specific time when I made the register entry. It was all rather hurried, you see. Mrs. Crane was most anxious to have the funeral arrangements completed quickly, and I confess I let some of the formalities slip in the rush." "Mrs. Crane was anxious for haste?" "Oh yes, most insistent. She said it seemed cruel to delay when there was no family to consult beyond the nephew, and he had given his approval by telegram. She arranged everything with remarkable efficiency. I was grateful for her help, actually. These things can be so awkward when there's no close family to manage the details." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And Dr. Haydock certified the death when exactly?" The vicar consulted a small notebook on his desk. "The evening of the 21st, I believe. Yes, here it is. He signed the certificate at 8 o'clock that evening. The burial followed the next afternoon." "Very prompt indeed." "Mrs. Crane felt it was for the best. She said Mr. Bell had been a private man who would have appreciated a quiet, swift conclusion to matters." The vicar paused, then added with a touch of defensiveness, "It all seemed quite appropriate at the time. I saw no reason to question her judgment." "Of course not," Miss Marple assured him. "Mrs. Crane is known for her sound judgment in such matters." She thanked him for his time and made her way out through the churchyard, pausing at Arthur Bell's grave. The snow had long since melted, and the earth lay dark and level beneath the simple headstone. Fresh flowers had been placed there recently, daffodils, forced early and expensive for January. Mrs. Crane's work, Miss Marple had no doubt. She stood for a moment in the quiet afternoon, considering the sequence of events as she now understood them. Arthur Bell had died on the evening of January 21st. Dr. Haydock had certified the death at 8 o'clock. The burial had taken place the following afternoon, less than 24 hours later. This haste suggested several possibilities. Perhaps Mrs. Crane had simply been acting out of consideration for the deceased's privacy, as the vicar believed. But haste could also indicate a desire to conclude matters before questions could be asked, before details could be examined too closely. And then there was the matter of who had summoned Haydock in the first place. Someone had discovered Arthur Bell's death and called for the doctor. Someone who had been present in or near Arthur Bell's cottage that evening. Miss Marple walked slowly back through the churchyard, her mind tracing connections that grew clearer with each step. The telegram sent to Tom Bell on the morning of the 21st, before Arthur Bell had actually died. The hasty burial arrangements, the missing time of death in the register, the scarf that did not belong to Tom Bell, drying by Mrs. Crane's fire. These elements formed a pattern, and at the centre of that pattern was Mrs. Crane, organising and arranging, helping and managing, ensuring that everything was handled properly and promptly. But properly for whom? And what was being managed exactly? Miss Marple had known women like Mrs. Crane before, women of principle and conscience who found themselves in impossible situations and made choices they later regretted. Women who tried to put things right through grand gestures and careful arrangements, only to find that guilt could not be so easily managed. The visit to the grave before dawn made sense now. It was not about covering tracks or hiding evidence. It was about seeking forgiveness from someone who could no longer grant it. Kneeling in the snow and the darkness, trying to make peace with choices that could not be unmade. She reached the lich gate and paused, looking back at the churchyard one final time. The afternoon light slanted across the graves, touching the headstones with gold. Everything looked peaceful and orderly, just as it should be in a well-tended country churchyard. But beneath that order lay secrets that wanted desperately to be told. And Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence and her understanding of human weakness, was very close to hearing them. Tomorrow she would speak with Mrs. Crane again. Not to accuse, but to offer understanding. because sometimes the kindest thing one could do was to allow someone to unburden themselves of a truth they had been carrying alone. And Mrs. Crane, Miss Marple suspected, was very tired of carrying her burden by herself. Chapter 8. What the Register Did Not Record. Saturday morning brought one of those clear, bright winter days that seemed to sharpen everything into unusual clarity. The sky was a pale, clean blue, and the air held that particular crispness that makes one's breath visible and sounds carry with unusual precision. Miss Marple had sent a note to Lady Bantry after breakfast suggesting a walk if the weather held. Dolly had responded with characteristic enthusiasm, arriving at Miss Marple's cottage shortly before 10 o'clock, bundled in a woolen coat and looking as though she expected adventure. "I assume this constitutional has a purpose beyond exercise," she said as they set out along the lane. "You have that look about you, Jane, the one that means you've worked something out and want to demonstrate it to someone less astute." "I wouldn't put it quite so baldly," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. "But I did think a visit to the churchyard might be instructive. The snow has melted completely now, and one can see the ground more clearly." They walked in companionable silence for a time, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The village was quiet at this hour, most people occupied with their Saturday morning routines. A few thin columns of smoke rose from cottage chimneys, and somewhere a dog barked with lazy persistence at nothing in particular. As they approached the churchyard, Lady Bantry spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said, about snow melting because of warmth. It makes sense when one considers it properly, though I'm still not entirely certain what it tells us." "It tells us," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone was at Arthur Bell's grave for a considerable length of time, long enough to prevent the snow from settling or to melt it after it had fallen. They entered through the lich gate, and Miss Marple led the way along the path she had traversed so many times in recent days. The churchyard looked entirely different without its covering of snow. The grass showed patches of winter brown, and the grave stood stark and clearly defined against the bare earth. Arthur Bell's resting place was near the eastern edge, sheltered somewhat by the ancient yew hedge that marked the boundary of consecrated ground. Miss Marple paused beside it, her gaze moving slowly over the grave and its surroundings. "You see," she said, gesturing with her umbrella, "how the grave lies closer to the hedge than most of the others. The yew would provide some protection from wind, certainly, but not from snow falling straight down. There's nothing overhead to prevent the snow from settling here." "No," Lady Bantry agreed, studying the position with new interest. "So the shelter theory doesn't hold?" "Indeed not, which means we must consider other explanations for why this grave, and only this grave, was bare of snow that morning." Miss Marple moved a few steps closer, her eyes scanning the ground with careful attention. The surrounding stones all bore snow evenly, the path showed traces of compression, as though someone had walked upon it before more snow fell, but the grave itself was completely clear. "You said someone must have been here, standing or kneeling, you thought." "I did think that, yes." Miss Marple paused, her expression growing more thoughtful. "But I've been reconsidering. Standing would leave the sides of the grave still covered in snow, and kneeling would only clear a portion. The entire grave was bare, Dolly. Every bit of the earth above the coffin." Lady Bantry frowned, trying to work through the implications. "I don't understand. How could someone clear the entire grave unless they—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "Unless they were lying upon it?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone lay on this grave in the hours before dawn while the snow was still falling. They lay here long enough that their body heat prevented the snow from settling on the grave itself, while it accumulated normally everywhere else." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rustling through the yew branches. Lady Bantry looked at the grave with something approaching horror. But who would do such a thing, and why? "Someone in deep distress," Miss Marple replied. "Someone overwhelmed by grief or guilt or both. Someone who needed to be as close as possible to the person buried here, regardless of cold or propriety or the risk of discovery." Mrs. Crane? I believe so, yes. The evidence points quite clearly in her direction. She had access to the churchyard key. She had the scarf that was still damp days later, suggesting it had been thoroughly soaked. She arranged the funeral with unusual haste and has been anxious to dismiss the mystery of the bare grave as inconsequential. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm, and she has been carrying a burden of a guilt that has grown too heavy for her to bear alone. They stood together in the pale, morning light, two elderly women contemplating the extremes of human emotion that could drive someone to such desperate measures. But what could possibly make her feel that guilty? Dolly asked. Arthur Bell died of natural causes, didn't he? Dr. Haydock certified it. Natural causes, yes, but natural causes can be hastened or delayed by human action or inaction. Miss Marple turned away from the grave and began walking slowly towards the church. Consider the sequence of events, Dolly. Arthur Bell died on the evening of January 21st. But someone sent a telegram to Tom Bell that morning before the death occurred. Someone who knew Arthur Bell was seriously ill and likely to die. Mrs. Crane? Most probably. She would have been the one to know if Arthur Bell had come to her for help. Miss Marple paused at the church door, her hand resting lightly on the old wood. I think Arthur Bell came to Mrs. Crane's cottage on the evening of the 20th or the morning of the 21st. Perhaps he was already unwell. Perhaps he collapsed there. And I think Mrs. Crane, for reasons of propriety or fear of scandal, delayed in summoning medical help. You mean she let him die? I mean she may have hesitated when immediate action might have saved him. These things happen, Dolly, more often than we like to admit. A woman alone, a man in her home, the possibility of gossip. She may have waited too long to call Dr. Haydock, hoping Arthur Bell would recover on his own. Or she may have called for help only after it was too late. Lady Bantry absorbed this in troubled silence, and the guilt drove her to the grave in the middle of the night. To seek some form of communion with the dead, yes. To lie where he lay and perhaps to beg forgiveness in the only way still available to her. Miss Marple's voice was compassionate now, stripped of any judgment. It's a terrible thing to know that one's fear or pride contributed to another person's death, even when the death itself was from natural causes. They walked back through the churchyard toward the gate. The morning had grown warmer, and somewhere a thrush was singing with determined cheerfulness. What will you do? Lady Bantry asked as they reached the lane. I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that I will give Mrs. Crane the opportunity to speak. Not to the police necessarily, but to someone who will understand. Secrets grow more poisonous the longer they're kept, and I believe Mrs. Crane is ready to be free of hers. And if she won't talk? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Then she won't. I cannot force confession from anyone, nor would I wish to. But I can offer understanding, and sometimes that is enough to open doors that have been locked by fear. They parted at the corner, and Miss Marple continued homeward alone. The pieces of the puzzle had arranged themselves into a coherent whole now. Not a crime in the legal sense, but a human tragedy of hesitation and consequence, of pride meeting its price in guilt. This afternoon she would call on Mrs. Crane, and this time she would not allow the conversation to end in evasions and half-truths. The time had come for clarity, however painful that clarity might be. The snow had melted, and the truth, like the dark earth beneath, was ready to be revealed. Chapter 9. A kindness recalled too late. Miss Marple called on Mrs. Crane shortly after 3 o'clock that afternoon. She had chosen the time deliberately, knowing it to be the hour when Mrs. Crane would ordinarily be at home, her morning duties completed and the evening ones yet to begin. It was a time when people were most themselves, neither braced for the day nor preparing to face the night. Mrs. Crane opened the door with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit, though whether with dread or relief was difficult to determine. She looked tired, Miss Marple noticed, with the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained emotional strain. Miss Marple. Her voice was level but not quite steady. "Please, come in." The sitting room was noticeably cooler than it had been on Miss Marple's previous visit. The fire burned low in the grate, and the window stood slightly open despite the winter chill. It was as though Mrs. Crane had been trying to air out more than just the room. They settled themselves without the usual preliminary courtesies. Mrs. Crane did not offer tea, and Miss Marple did not expect it. Some conversations required a directness that hospitality only complicated. "I think," Miss Marple began gently, "that you know why I've come." Mrs. Crane's hands lay folded in her lap, gripped together tightly enough that the knuckles showed white. "Yes, I suppose I do." "I want you to understand that I haven't come to judge or to accuse. I've simply come to listen, if you wish to speak. Sometimes the hardest burdens are the ones we carry alone." For a long moment, Mrs. Crane said nothing. She stared at her hands, and Miss Marple could see the internal struggle playing across her features. Pride and shame, relief and fear, all warring for dominance. "It was an accident," Mrs. Crane said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must believe that. I never meant for any harm to come to him." "I do believe that," Miss Marple said quietly. "Will you tell me what happened?" Mrs. Crane drew a shaky breath and began to speak, her words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum as though a dam had finally broken. "Arthur came to my cottage on the evening of the 20th. It was late, nearly 9 o'clock. I was surprised to see him. We were friendly, as you know, but we didn't usually call on one another after dark. It wasn't proper." She paused, and a bitter smile touched her lips. "Propriety! How that word has haunted me." "He was unwell?" He seemed confused, disoriented. He said he'd been feeling poorly all day but had thought it just a winter chill. He'd been walking and had turned toward my cottage without quite meaning to. The cold had made things worse, I think. By the time he reached my door, he was trembling badly. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to continue. I brought him inside, of course, sat him by the fire, made him tea. He seemed to improve a little, with the warmth. We talked for perhaps half an hour. He was apologetic for the intrusion, kept saying he would go home soon. Mrs. Crane's voice caught. And then he collapsed, simply folded forward in his chair, as though all the strength had left him. "And you didn't call for Dr. Haydock immediately?" "No." The word was filled with anguish. "I didn't. I got him to the sofa, made him comfortable. He seemed to be breathing normally, and I convinced myself that he had merely fainted from the cold and the exertion. I told myself he would recover if I just let him rest." "You were afraid of what people would say?" "Yes." Mrs. Crane's composure crumbled entirely. "Yes, I was afraid. A widow and a bachelor alone together in the evening. People would have talked. They would have assumed. Oh, I don't know what they would have assumed, but it would have been ugly. My reputation, my standing in the village, everything I've built since Harold died." She covered her face with her hands. "So I waited. I sat with him, watched him sleep, told myself he would wake and be himself again, and I could send him home without anyone knowing he'd been there." Miss Marple's expression held only compassion. "But he didn't wake." "He did once, around midnight. He seemed lucid enough to speak. He told me I'd been kind, that he was grateful. He asked me to call his nephew if anything should happen." Fresh tears spilled down Mrs. Crane's cheeks. "I promised I would, and then he closed his eyes again. I thought he was sleeping." "When did you realize the truth?" "Morning. Early morning, before dawn. I woke in the chair where I'd been dozing and went to check on him." Her voice broke completely. "He was gone. Sometime during those hours, while I sat there protecting my precious reputation, Arthur Bell had slipped away." The silence in the room was profound. Outside, a cart rattled past on the road, and someone called a greeting to a neighbour. Life continued in all its ordinary rhythms, while in this small sitting room, a woman faced the consequences of choices made in fear. "I telephoned to Haydock at first light," Mrs. Crane continued after a moment. "Told him I'd found Arthur collapsed in his cottage when I went to check on him. It wasn't entirely a lie. I'd moved him back to his own cottage during the night, you see. I couldn't bear the thought of his body being discovered in my home. So I walked him there, half carried him, really, through the dark and the cold. It was snowing by then. That's when the scarf got wet. Yes, his scarf. I'd wrapped it around him for warmth when he first arrived. I wore it back home because I was frozen through. It seemed such a small thing to notice, a wet scarf, but I suppose small things always reveal the truth in the end. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Dr. Haydock certified the death as natural causes. It was natural causes. A heart seizure, he said. Arthur's heart had been weak for some time, though he'd told no one. The cold and the exertion brought on the final attack. Mrs. Crane's voice turned desperate. Don't you see? He would have died regardless. Whether I called for help immediately or waited, the outcome would have been the same. Dr. Haydock told me as much. Perhaps, Miss Marple said gently. You don't believe that, do you? You believe that if you'd called for help the moment he collapsed, he might have had a chance. I don't know what to believe any more. Mrs. Crane wiped her eyes with shaking hands. All I know is that Arthur Bell died alone because I was too proud, too frightened of gossip to do the right thing. And no amount of arranging perfect funerals or visiting graves in the middle of the night will change that. The grave, Miss Marple prompted softly. I couldn't bear it. The thought of him lying there, of how he must have felt in those final hours, confused and alone. I kept thinking that if I could just be close to him, if I could lie where he lay, perhaps it would ease the guilt somehow, she laughed hollowly. Foolish, I know, but grief and guilt make us foolish, don't they? They make us human, Miss Marple corrected. You loved him, didn't you? Not romantically, perhaps, but in that quiet way that grows between people who understand one another. Mrs. Crane nodded, unable to speak. And he knew it, Miss Marple continued. His last words to you were of gratitude and kindness. He didn't blame you, Mrs. Crane. He asked you to call his nephew, to help even in his final moments. That tells us what we need to know about his feelings toward you. It doesn't absolve me. No, Miss Marple agreed. Nothing absolves us of our mistakes. But understanding them, acknowledging them, learning to live with them, that is what we owe to those we failed. Not dramatic gestures or elaborate penances, but honest recognition of our human weakness. Mrs. Crane sat in silence, her tears falling quietly now, and Miss Marple waited with the patience that came from years of understanding that some truths needed time to settle before they could be born. Finally, Mrs. Crane spoke. What happens now? Will you tell the police? The vicar? That, said Miss Marple, is for you to decide on. Chapter 10. Snow, Stone, and a Quiet Confession. Inspector Slack arrived at Mrs. Crane's cottage within the hour, summoned not by Miss Marple but by Mrs. Crane herself. She had insisted upon it, despite Miss Marple's gentle suggestion that the law might find little to pursue in what had been ultimately a death from natural causes complicated by human fear. I need to tell the truth, Mrs. Crane had said, her voice steadier now that the decision had been made. Not because I expect punishment or absolution, but because Arthur deserves that much. He deserves to have the truth known, even if it reflects poorly on me. The inspector listened to her account with an expression that progressed from scepticism through surprise to something approaching sympathy. He was not, Miss Marple had always thought, an insensitive man, merely one who preferred his cases to fit into neat categories. This one clearly did not. You moved the body, he said when Mrs. Crane had finished. That's tampering with evidence, Mrs. Crane. I know. Her voice was quiet but firm. I moved him back to his own cottage because I couldn't face the scandal of his body being found in my home. It was cowardly and wrong, and I've regretted it every moment since. Inspector Slack made notes in his pocketbook with more care than usual, his pencil moving slowly across the page. Dr. Haydock's certificate stands, heart failure, natural causes. That hasn't changed. But the circumstances were unfortunate. You should have called for help immediately. but de Haydock has already confirmed that the delay wouldn't have altered the outcome. Mr. Bell's heart was severely compromised. The cold and exertion had already done their damage before he reached your door. Mrs. Crane closed her eyes briefly. You're saying there's no legal consequence? I'm saying, Inspector Slack replied, with uncharacteristic gentleness, that you made a poor choice driven by fear in a man who, dying regardless, died in your sitting room rather than in a hospital where he would have died anyway. The law doesn't punish bad judgment when no crime has been committed. He paused, then added, though I expect you've been punishing yourself quite adequately. After the inspector departed, Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Crane to the vicarage. The vicar received them in his study, his face growing increasingly sombre as Mrs. Crane repeated her account. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him. This is a matter of conscience more than doctrine, he said at last. You acted out of fear, and that fear led to choices you regret. But you did not cause Arthur Bell's death, Mrs. Crane. His heart failed, as it would have failed regardless of where he was or who was with him. But I might have eased his passing. I might have ensured he wasn't alone in those final hours. He wasn't alone, the vicar pointed out gently. He was with you. He told you that you'd been kind to him. Those were his last coherent words, were they not? Mrs. Crane nodded, unable to speak. And perhaps that is what you should remember. Not your fear or your failings, but the fact that Arthur Bell's final conscious moments were spent in the company of someone he trusted, someone who had shown him kindness over the years. The vicar rose and moved to the window, looking out at the churchyard beyond. I will, of course, note the actual circumstances of his passing in the parish records. The truth should be preserved even when it's uncomfortable. But I see no reason to make a public declaration that would serve only to satisfy gossip and damage your reputation without bringing any benefit to Arthur Bell's memory. The final visit of the day was to Tom Bell, who was discovered packing his belongings at the inn with the air of a man eager to be away. He received Mrs. Crane and Miss Marple in the small private parlour, his expression wary. Mrs. Crane told him everything, her voice growing steadier with each repetition of the story. Tom Bell listened in silence, his face revealing little, until she reached the part about his uncle's last words. He asked you to call me. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, he wanted you to know. I sent the telegram the next morning, but by then, she faltered. I'm sorry, Mr. Bell. I'm sorry I didn't act more quickly. I'm sorry your uncle died thinking he was a burden to me when he was nothing of the sort. To Miss Marple's surprise, Tom Bell's eyes grew bright with tears. He always thought he was a burden to everyone. He apologised constantly for existing, for taking up space, for needing anything at all. He wiped his eyes roughly. I should have come sooner, should have visited more often, but work always seemed more pressing, and Uncle Arthur never complained, so I told myself it could wait. We all tell ourselves such things, Miss Marple said quietly, until suddenly there's no more time. Tom Bell nodded. Thank you for telling me the truth, Mrs. Crane. I know it can't have been easy. He hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, I don't think you did anything malicious. Fear makes fools of us all sometimes. After they left him, Mrs. Crane turned to Miss Marple on the inn steps. Will the village ever forgive me? The village, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, will never know the full story unless you choose to tell them. And even if they did know, I suspect that they would surprise you with their understanding. People are more compassionate than we give them credit for, particularly when the fault is one they can imagine committing themselves. She left Mrs. Crane at her cottage door and made her way homeward through the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. The sky had turned a pale gold, and the air had that particular clarity that comes before sunset in winter. 2 days later, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry walked past the churchyard on their way to the lending library. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, a light dusting that covered everything with perfect democracy. Dolly paused at the gate, looking in toward the graves. There, she said, gesturing with one gloved hand. All the same now. Miss Marple followed her gaze. The churchyard lay white and peaceful, every grave wearing its covering of snow with equal grace. Arthur Bell's resting place was indistinguishable from all the others, neither bare nor marked by any sign of the drama that had surrounded it. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said, "but people are never quite so tidy as snow." "No," Dolly agreed, "though I suppose that's what makes them interesting." She resumed walking, then added thoughtfully, "Do you think Mrs. Crane will be all right?" "I think she will carry this with her always, but perhaps less heavily now that the truth has been spoken. Confession doesn't erase guilt, but it does make it more bearable." Miss Marple adjusted her scarf against the cold. "And she has work to do, you know. Tom Bell has asked her to help organise a small memorial for his uncle at the church. Nothing elaborate, just a simple service where the few who knew Arthur Bell can share their memories of him. That's good of young Bell. I think he sees it as a way of making peace with his own regrets. We all fail the people we care about in small ways and large. The question is what we do with those failures afterward." They continued on to the library, their conversation turning to lighter matters. Behind them, the churchyard remained quiet beneath its fresh covering of snow, and the winter afternoon settled into its customary stillness. Miss Marple thought about Arthur Bell sometimes in the days that followed, about a quiet man who had lived without fanfare and